Hi everyone, this is Sheila Shaffie and welcome back to another episode by ProcessArc. In today's video, we're going to continue our conversation around process mapping. And a few weeks ago, I gave you guys kind of a long checklist of items to consider before you physically sit down and start documenting a process. We've uncovered some of those elements, like what is the intent of your process mapping? What are you trying to get out of the exercise? And how do you define the boundaries, which is the start and the end point of your documentation activity? In today's video, we're going to talk about segmentation. Now, the minute I say the word segmentation, your mind may be wandering towards customer segmentation or product segmentation, and you're actually heading in the right direction. When it comes to process mapping, one of the things we have to consider are the mutations that exist within a business process. Now, I'm not talking about something grotesque or a monster. I'm talking about variations, natural variations that may exist in a process. So you may be actually working the process, or the process may be flowing differently depending on the customer that it's trying to service, a product that's trying to manufacture, or you may have differences in the way you do things depending on your geographical location. So there are ways that a process can change over time or could be set up differently at its inception point that is important for us to keep in mind. Because when it comes to documenting, what you're trying to understand is how the process is working. So it's also important to document the mutations, the points of variation from one process to another so that you can really understand what's going on. So let's keep it simple. I don't want to give you, 50 things to consider to make sure you've uncovered all the mutations or variation points in a process. It's really quite simple. You have two questions to consider or to ask yourself when it comes to figuring out whether or not a point of difference in a process is important for you to document or not. Question number one is, when it comes to processing something, whatever that process map is, whatever that process is trying to do, does it take different steps depending on products, services, customer, or the region that process exists? So if the answer is yes, the process looks different, the physical steps we take to do the work is different, then great, keep that in mind, because that means you have something important that needs to be captured in your process map. And the second question is, does the time that it takes for you to complete that process from beginning to end is different between, for example, product A or product B, customer A or customer B? And again, if the answer is yes, then you absolutely have to document those points of variation in your process. Because if something takes less time or more time, or sequentially has different process steps or decision points, those are important variations to the process that you need to capture in your documentation. So here's an example. Again, I keep going back to applying for an insurance policy. You may think as a problem solver, as someone who's been tasked with solving some sort of a problem with onboarding a new customer, as, hey, onboarding is simply one process. It's just get the application, submit it to underwriting, and then we get a final decision, and ultimately we send the welcome kit to the customer. But if you start to really consider the fact that we really have two key products in insurance, which may be life or disability, and depending on whether it's life or disability, the requirements or the data points that we collect from the customer are different, and the decision points that we have under consideration for underwriting is different between life and disability. So as a result of that, our acceptance rates is different. You're beginning to realize that, hey, even though I was responsible for uncovering issues around onboarding, we really have two different set of business processes under the umbrella of onboarding that supports that part of the business. So just remember that when it comes to process documentation, there may be variations that are hidden in the process or that people may take for granted as just a way of doing business that are going to be materially important to you as you've been charged to uncover opportunities for improvement or just capture how things get done so that you can use that documentation as a foundation for transformational activities. So keep remembering that you have to ask yourself the two key questions. Are the process steps that I'm taking different, and or is the time required to complete that process different? And if the answer to either one of those questions is a yes, make sure that you document those process maps as they exist, and then you can kind of combine them together later on. That's it for segmentation. Next week, we'll continue going down our checklist. I'm going to be talking about next week around the topic of the different types of process mapping techniques that exist. What's different between value stream mapping versus a flow chart versus a customer journey mapping. There are different process maps that are out there. They each have their own strengths and weaknesses and serve very different purposes. We'll go through that next week. In the meantime, if you have any questions around segmentation, points of variation in the process, what you should consider as a key difference and what isn't a really key difference in your process, make sure you leave those questions down in the comments section below. I look forward to having you next week, and thank you so much for joining me today.